Hello, and welcome to another edition of Prophecy in the News. I'm Gary Stearman, and this book that I'm holding is the best-selling book in the history of Prophecy in the News. It's called Psalm 83. Stay tuned and find out why it's such a big seller. Bill Salus, welcome to Prophecy in the News.
Gary, it's good to be back with you again and seeing you in good health again.
Oh, thanks for saying so, and thanks to all of you who prayed for me during my absence. I do appreciate it. This book, Psalm 83, by author and lecturer Bill Salus, is absolutely making big waves wherever it is sold. And today we're going to talk about what's inside this book that makes it so exciting. Bill, we have spoken before about the essential premise of Psalm 83, and of course, as you might imagine, Psalm 83 is all about Psalm 83 in the Bible. In some ways, this is a very cryptic psalm. In some ways, it requires a lot of study to understand what it really says. In other ways, it just jumps off the page, right?
Absolutely, and just by brief review, some of the people may have heard us talk about this topic, but it's an ancient prophecy written 3,000 years ago by a psalmist, Asaph, who was also a prophet. 2 Chronicles 29:30, he was a prophet. And during a time of Israel's unprecedented blessings from the Abrahamic covenant, 3,000 years ago, they had their King David. They were talking about building their temple. Rain was falling in due season. They were winning wars. They were annexing territory. Asaph the prophet gets this prophecy that is nothing short of a genocidal attempt of the Jewish people and a confiscation of the Promised Land, the Holy Land, by Arab enemies that today and then shared common borders with Israel. They come together. They form a plan, a devious plan against the Israelis, is what the prophecy says. And the goal is to destroy the nation of Israel, that the name of Israel can be remembered no more in verse 4. And it says they form a confederacy, an Arab confederacy. And then it goes through in verses 6 through 8 and lists who's in this confederacy. Very specific by their ancient names, but I'll tell you who their modern-day equivalents are today. Palestinian refugees, Hamas, Hezbollah, Muslim Brotherhood. Of course, that would mean Egypt and Lebanon, where Hezbollah is. Jordan, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Iraq. Israel's Arab enemies, sharing common borders with Israel, that have burgeoned terrorist entities within them when they realized through the conventional wars of 48 and 67 and 73 that they couldn't destroy Israel. They put these terrorist groups together and stuff, and here we are now at this point in time, and Israel has never been under more greater existential threat and looking down the barrel of Psalm 83 as we speak these days.
And the people who have confederated against Israel say one thing in Psalm 83, come and let us cut them off from being a nation. Talk about stark, terse wording. Cut them off from being a nation. Today we think of national Israel as maybe the world's greatest miracle. It became a nation, 1948. So actually Israel had to be a nation before this psalm could be activated, if you will, before it could be cut off.
We brought that up. You can't cut the nation off that the name Israel be no more in remembrance. You have to have an Israel, so you're absolutely right. The biggest miracle, the super sign of the end times. Even Jesus referenced to it in Matthew 24, 1948. And here we are 6 decades later, and Israel is in great peril right now.
Let me just say a word or two about the book, Psalm 83. The layout of this book, by the way, I love the cover. It's got a map on it showing the Muslim Brotherhood and Egypt and Hamas and the Palestinians and Jordan and Syria, all represented by red arrows jumping across to Israel. And the book itself is laid out in a beautiful fashion. In fact, we're going to have some shots of it on the screen as I talk about it. It's laid out so that you can see the chapter divisions. You can understand what you're going to be reading about in each of the chapters. It's just got a terrific balance, and it's a good read. I like it. I've read it myself, and you'll like it too, particularly when you begin to get a sense of what it's talking about. Now, Psalm 83 is a prophecy written by a prophet, Asaph. and we have spoken before about the fact that Asaph was a prophet. The prophecy harkens back to the days of Gideon destroying the Midianites and to the days of the judges and so forth. And it says, in fact, there's going to be a repeat of something that happened a long, long time ago. And to me, that's very exciting, because when I read about Gideon and the Midianites, that 300 men wiping out all those Midianites, how is that possible? That's a miracle. Well, it speaks of a modern miracle. To me, the modern miracle is that Israel is going to stand up against this huge oppressor. And of course, that encourages me because I'm a Bible-believing Christian.
Absolutely. Not only is Israel a modern-day miracle, but so is the Israeli Defense Forces. And this, you're pointing out in verses 9 through 11 in Psalm 83, going back to those references that you pick up in Judges chapters 4 through 8, where the Israeli Defense Forces of that time, you know, the story of Gideon, 300 men went and fought against 120,000 Midianites and won, and took out from top to bottom not only the infantry, but the kings, the princes, and the nobles. And the problem that the Midianites was the problem with, as well as he also talks about the Canaanites in verses 10 and 11, drawing back to Sisera and Jabin, is that they wanted they oppressed Israel, and they had control of the land. They wanted the land, which is, we're told in Psalm 83 verse 12, this Arab confederacy, they want the pastures of God for themselves as a possession. The same scenario now. So we draw these comparisons and these similarities. The Israeli Defense Forces then, empowered by the Lord to win a war against their historical enemies, and those enemies never oppress Israel again. Asaph saying, do the same thing when this prophecy happens, and I think we're watching it set up right now.
Now, all of this is very exciting, but I want to let Bill get a little bit deeper into Psalm 83, and there have been a few critics. A lot of people have reacted to Psalm 83 by saying, well, wait a minute, Psalm 83 was already fulfilled in the past. It's no longer an active prophecy since it was already fulfilled. How do you respond to that, Bill?
Yeah, very good. And it's good to talk about the objections, you know, because
Sure.
2 Peter 1:20 says, no prophecy is subject to private interpretation. So, you know, when these objections were levied toward me, or about Psalm 83, not offensively against me, I took them to heart carefully and prayerfully. I wanted to make sure that that truly my hypothesis that was presented in Israelistine and now upgraded now in the Psalm 83 book was accurate. And so one of the arguments was, well, Psalm 83 was fulfilled in the Old Testament historically, and that would draw to 2 Chronicles 20. At that time, there were 3, maybe 4 members of the 10-member confederacy listed in Psalm 83 that did come against Israel. You had the Ammonites and the Moabites, which would have been northern and southern, central Jordan, and there were 2 other populations. Different translations put them as either the Edomites, the Meunites. Some people might even throw Syria in there, depending on, you know, the Masoretic text and the Latin Vulgate and even some of the new translations of our modern English. So they're not clear exactly on all the specific populations when you compare these, but what is clear is not all 10 of the populations were involved. So it cannot be a final fulfillment of Psalm 83, because when a Bible prophecy finds fulfillment, it finds it 100% accurately with all the details.
Exact.
And that did not happen. You can't say because 3 or 4 of Israel's enemies that happened to be in Psalm 83 came against Israel, therefore we'll check that one as a fulfilled prophecy. You can't do that.
Well, what about some people who say, well, wait a minute, Psalm 83 was fulfilled already in 1948 or maybe in 1967, the Six-Day War?
Right. You've got some similarities of concern there as well. And I'm going to give you 2 reasons why I don't believe they were fulfilled then. The basic one is, let's talk about the head count of the Confederacy. In 1967, we'll start there. It was primarily Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. Now, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan appear to be in Psalm 83. But that's only 3 of the 10 populations. 1948, a little different on the flip side. You had more populations involved in that war. You had Iraq and Lebanon and Jordan, and so you could start thinking, well, maybe 1948 was a fulfillment, but then you also had involvement with the Sudan and Pakistan and they're not even listed in Psalm 83. But when I think the real argument I would say here is that you brought it up when you talked about Gideon and his 300-man army. Asaph is petitioning in verses 9 through 11. Deal with them like Gideon did with the Midianites, and Deborah and Barak, the prophetess Deborah and her general Barak did with the Canaanites, where they defeated those oppressors, and you'll never see the Midianites or the Canaanites oppressing Israel ever again, historically or in the Bible. And I think that's what Asaph is saying. Put an end to this. Don't let them oppress us ever again.
Wow.
And
now, as an aside, that would be a miracle, because Israel is vastly outnumbered today. When you look at a map of the Middle East, tiny little Israel, and by the way, Israel is already too big in the eyes of her critics. They want to make Israel even smaller. But you have tiny little Israel surrounded by this vast network of Islamic nations, and they have one drumbeat day and night, jihad, jihad, you know. Let's cut Israel off from being a nation, the exact wording in Psalm 83. Drive Israel into the sea. I hear various phrases that they use, but in effect it is, we want Israel, the little Satan, not to exist anymore. President Ahmadinejad of Iran is very fond of calling Israel the little Satan and the United States the great Satan, and he wants to wipe both of them out so that they don't exist anymore at all. And yet this prophecy, Bill, says that the exact reverse is going to happen, that the little tiny nation is going to wipe out the great big confederacy. That's amazing. And the question arises, do you actually believe this?
well, I believe it, and it's on the subtitle. Psalm 83, the missing prophecy, revealed how Israel becomes the next Middle superpower. Now, that's a pretty bold statement.
Yes.
But I support it with scriptures that point out through the prophets, because one of the objections also has been, well, if this is really a prophecy, you would think that some of the major and minor prophets would have spoken about it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm going to talk about a few of those prophecies for just a moment, because they have to be addressed. They have not found fulfillment yet, and it pictures an Israeli defense forces existing in fulfillment of Bible prophecy
and
to the end of winning against the Arab enemies.
Just for a second, and I want to say what he's about to talk about, and it's the part I've been waiting to get to, because there are a lot of people who sort of confabulate Psalm 83 with some other prophecies and say all of these get fulfilled together. This is all the same. For example, some say that Psalm 83 is the same as Ezekiel 38, which everybody knows about, the famous invasion of Gog, the land of Magog, coming down from the north and with this other confederacy of nations. And some people say, well, Psalm 83 is just another view of Ezekiel 38. How do you react to that?
Well, that's, again, we got that objection as well. And the other one, of course, that they think it will be fulfilled in the Armageddon campaign. Let's talk about Ezekiel 38, and then we'll ultimately get into what did the prophet say about how does Israel annex more land and survive this and become a Middle superpower. Ezekiel 38, great starting point. 52 very descriptive passages, and in those 52 very descriptive passages we have prescriptions of what Israel is supposed to look like. They're supposed to be dwelling securely in the latter days, dwelling in the midst of the land, without walls, bars, nor gates. And they're very prosperous because Russia comes for plunder and booty, which, by the way, is a different motive than Psalm 83. They want to take the pastures of God for themselves as a possession.
That's a good point.
Got a difference right there.
Yeah.
Different motive, different consortia of nations. I call Psalm 83 in the book an inner circle. They share common borders with Israel. They're Arabs and they're Muslims, predominantly. The Ezekiel 38 confederacy, I call an outer ring. They don't even share common borders with Israel, and yet they've got to come through the Arab countries in Psalm 83 to even get to Israel. And you would think that certainly Ezekiel, who was very descriptive about who he listed in Ezekiel 38 and 39, 9 populations, Meshech, Tubal, Togarmah, etc. I won't go through each one of them. None of them share common borders with Israel. And so he doesn't list any of the Psalm 83 Edomites, Ammonites, Moabites into Ezekiel 38. So some people will say, well, look, that he did put them in there because in Ezekiel 38:6 it says there'll be with Russia, there'll be many peoples with thee. And indeed there will be 9 major populations in today's modern day equivalents Iran, Turkey, Libya, the southern steppes, breakaway republics of Russia, probably going on through down to Ethiopia, Sudan, Somalia. That's a general consensus. Again, outer ring, don't share common borders with Israel. So then the thought is, well, why didn't he at least list Edomites and Ammonites and Moabites? Well, you know, it's interesting because Ezekiel is very familiar with all those populations. And one way or another, in his 48 chapters, he's listed the Psalm 83 countries in one way or another, whether they're Egypt or the Hagarenes or whatever. So he omits them. I think he intentionally omits them because they're not involved. Why would he not include them? He's very descriptive about who he includes, and he omits them. I find that as probably an intentional omission because they're not involved in Ezekiel 38 and 39. Different motives. Ezekiel 38 wants the plunder and booty. Psalm 83, they want the land. Different destructions. Psalm 83, they're going to be defeated by the Israeli Defense Forces. Ezekiel 38, they're going to be defeated by the Lord through hailstone, fire, and brimstone, we're told. And different populations entirely.
Different ethnic groups involved, including the far north, including Gomer, which would be Eastern Europe, maybe as far north as Germany. So you've got different groups involved. This is fascinating to me because I think if there is a popular prophecy in the Bible, it's Ezekiel 38. Everybody's been talking about this one for 100 years. You can go back and find books that were printed in the early 20th century talking about a Russian invasion. And by the time World War II had ended, Ezekiel 38 became a very, very popular prophecy among dispensationalists. But you're adding a dimension. You're saying, yes, Ezekiel 38 is going to happen, but Psalm 83 is going to happen. Are you talking about two different locations in time? You're talking about one thing leading to another. What are you talking about here?
Two distinct different prophecies, different time frames, different motives, different destructions, different populations. The reason I put Psalm 83 as the preceding prophecy before Ezekiel 38, I said briefly, there's conditions that Israel has to meet before Ezekiel 38 can find fulfillment. Some of them they've met. It is the latter years, Ezekiel 38:8. They have been coming out from the nations of the world. It's questionable whether they dwell smack dab in the center of the land, which would technically be Jordan if you looked at the Abrahamic covenant from Genesis 15:18, the river of Egypt, the Nile, to the river Euphrates. That would put Jordan sort of in the center. But, maybe you could say they're in the center of the land now, that little strip of Israel now. But they're not dwelling securely. The Hebrew words are yeshav v'thaj. And it's historical, biblical precedent would be dwelling securely because you've secured that safety through a military victory. Okay? They're not dwelling securely. They've got enemies all around them. In fact, since the Arab Spring, they've never faced a greater existential threat in all their history. They're supposed to be dwelling without walls, bars, nor gates, and yet we know there's a 403-mile wall running down the West Bank that separates Palestinian terror out of Israel proper. At some points, that wall is about 25 feet high. Checkpoints and security checkpoints throughout Israel, not dwelling securely. And then the question is, have they amassed that great spoil and plunder that Russia's going to put this formidable coalition together to come after? Because that's what they want. They covet this wealth of Israel. And I think about that, and I think Israel's doing well. They've got a lot of gas they're discovering and things like that. But if you look at this and put it into perspective, Israel's the size of New Jersey, roughly, today. That's until after Psalm 83, and I think they're going to get a little more land and stretch out their elbows and create better defensibility of their borders by getting land. But the point is this, is that it would be as if Russia said, they're getting Iran and Turkey and Libya and all these countries together, a big, big group of friends. It'd be like if Washington said, look, America, we got a problem with New Jersey. We need to get Canada, and we need to get Mexico. We need to all come together against New Jersey. That's just overkill to me. Okay, why does Russia need so many friends? Russia's got more nuclear weapons than anybody in any other country.
Right.
Why do they need so much big friends? Well, if Israel becomes a superpower and defeats their Arab enemies and exploits Arab resources, and it says in Ezekiel 38:13 they come for spoil. The Hebrew word is shalal, which is actually spoil of the despoilers. Could be another way to interpret that. So Israel's own inherent resources, Israel's exploitation of Arab booty and plunder, despoil. Now all of a sudden, Russia might need some big friends here to come against them.
Yes.
A very, very good point
In
I
fact,
point out.
Russia appears to be drawn into the Middle East, according to the language of Ezekiel 38, and a huge peripheral group of nations are drawn into the Middle East, meaning there's something going on there that's not going on right now.
Right.
Something bigger will have happened, and what sets up that something bigger is told to us in Psalm 83. Makes sense.
I believe so. You're going to have a different atlas of the region.
Yeah.
You're going to have a different distribution of wealth in the region. Israel is going to be extremely wealthy. In fact, Ezekiel 38 verse 13 talks about these merchants of Tarshish and their young lions. Somebody's going to want to be having commerce with Israel, a wealthy, a superpower Israel that now has great plunder and booty that Russia wants to come after.
By the way, if you've been listening to this and you've said, wow, there's a lot of visualization going on here, I'm trying to think of the map and where all these countries are. Bill has produced a 3 DVD set in which a lot of the maps and a lot of the diagrams of how he sees these things happening are right there in front of your eyes. So, and we'll tell you in a minute how you can get that DVD as well as the book. By the way, the DVD is very, I think, useful to give the visual perspective of all this thing, because if you haven't looked at maps and looked at lines of force and arrows, and it's hard to visualize all this. But once you see that, these prophecies just pop right out at you.
Well, this is the comments I've been getting at the churches and the conferences I speak at, is that some of the most helpful aspects are those images, those maps. Now all of a sudden it's real-time application. You're seeing the ancient names and superimposed upon them their modern-day equivalents. And you're going, oh, I recognize them now. And that's why the maps and the images are extremely important.
You know, again, Psalm 83 was written by Asaph. And Bill, it takes a good deal of time to explain who Asaph was and why this prophecy was written. Asaph was a seer. He was a visionary. He was a prophet. And if I go to the very last verse in Psalm 83, there's a great thought here, Bill. It says, that men may know that thou, whose name alone is Jehovah, art the Most High all over all the earth. The word Jehovah is printed in all caps in the King James Bible there.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted to put emphasis on it. The reason for this whole prophecy is that men may know that thou, whose name is Jehovah, art the Most High over all the earth. There's some contest right now. There's another competing God out there. He's called Allah. And people are saying his name is the highest name in all the heavens.
Mm-hmm.
But Asaph writes this, and he says, I want people to know, no, it's the name Jehovah that's the Most High over all the earth. Now, this is amazing to me to just sit here and think about this. We don't ordinarily think about a contest of the names of God. Which name is higher than which other name? And as Christians, we assume that our God is greater than all gods. He is the creator. But somebody needs to hear these words.
This is a very important point for very many reasons. You're absolutely right about the competing gods of the Middle East at this point in time. Not only the competing ones, but there's this attempt in what we call Chrislam to say that Allah and Jehovah are the same God.
Right.
No, they are not the same God, and there will be a distinction made here. What leads up to that verse 18 is dealing with this Arab confederacy, and he says, confound them, make them ashamed. I'm summarizing, like stubble, like chaff before the wind,
right,
that the world may know that thou art God, Jehovah, above all the nations of the world. So the point he's trying to make here, we worship a loving God here, and he would much rather have a relationship with these Arabs that are going to come against Israel and confederate to destroy them. But he has foreign policy in place. You brought it up many times on your program here in Genesis 12 and 3. Genesis 12, verses 2 and 3. If you bless Israel, you'll be blessed. It's Abraham, but it goes on through Jacob, Isaac, Jacob, and the Jews, Israel today. But if you curse them, you'll be cursed. This is a blatant attempt to curse Israel, to wipe them off the map, to take the promised land, to have another Arab state, to fly a flag of Palestine over it, and to say Allah Akbar, Allah is the greater God. Okay? That is not what's going to happen. They're going to be defeated, and then the Muslims, in large part, are going to start questioning Allah's Akbar. No, Allah is not the greater God. Allah is a false God, and you're making a very good point here. This is going to be the conclusion, the only conclusion that can come out of this victory.
Well, you read it again. It says, that men may know that thou, whose name alone is Jehovah, art the most high over all the earth. Let's hear it for our Lord God.
Absolutely. And again, the loving God. Again, he does not randomly levy judgments on countries. And yet we see, when you hear the prophets connecting to the peripheral prophecies, Egypt and Syria and the Palestinians and things, they're going to be judged because they're going to curse Israel. That's a choice they've made. That's a choice they've made.
Well, I mentioned early on in the program that this book, Psalm 83, has had the highest demand of any book we've ever offered. It has caught the imagination of Christians everywhere. The subtitle, The Missing Prophecy Revealed. It's all about Psalm 83. The book, yours for $15.95 plus shipping and handling. The DVD, which contains three over an hour long. Each of the three is over an hour long. DVDs of Bill speaking, using visual aids so you can see the maps, the charts, the ebb and flow of world powers. This DVD, yours for $19.95. If you'd like both of them, they're yours for $34.95 plus shipping and handling. Ask for the Psalm 83 package and you'll get the book and the DVD plus a bonus. We will mail you the latest issue of Prophecy in the News so you can see what our magazine is all about. Again, ask for the Psalm 83 package when you call. You've got the 800 number on your screen right now. And I guarantee you a good read. Psalm 83 is written, it's laid out somewhat artistically, if I may use that word, so that it draws the eye along through the pages as well as the mind. And it's a good and it's an easy read. It's laid out so that you can understand it. It even answers the critics. And in my opinion, the critics don't need to be answered. I just believe what you wrote. So it's a good read. Bill Salus, thanks for coming by.
Gary, thanks for having me on the program again, to being able to get this message out far and wide.
I love it when we're able to do this, and I think this is a particularly pertinent message, given what's going on in the world today. You know, our Lord's coming soon. Be ready. And, as we always say, even from the days of J.R. Church all the way up to the present, keep looking up. Prophecy in the News is a viewer-supported program made possible by our many friends around the world. Be sure you tune in every day for breaking news and our daily prophetic news updates at prophecyinthenews.com, or follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/prophecyinthenews.